I grew up in Roane County, Tennessee, on a dusty gravel road that was so far out you would only see one or two cars drive down it the entire day. I was the middle child, and while my sister spent most weekends hanging out with my mom, and my older brother spent his time with my dad, most Saturday mornings I walked through the dew-soaked pasture to my Granny Tollett and Papa Coy's small house that they had lived in for the past 50 years. It was an old place with 12-foot ceilings and those old-timey doors with those old keyholes that I would press my eye to and look through. The kitchen was on the outside of the house, or at least it had been once upon a time. And Granny Tollett was always in there cooking something, no matter what time of the day it was. And if she saw me, I'd be put to work right away, shelling beans or helping her roll biscuits, while she told me stories of the way life used to be. Stories of faith and wisdom. Oh, she was a master storyteller, and I've shared many of her stories over the past few years. My Papa Coy, on the other hand, he was what we called a yarn spinner, and whenever he told a story, it was best to roll your britches up, because it was about to get deep. I remember a particular Saturday. He spotted me as I walked across that pasture. There he stood with 2 cane poles in his hand and his old tackle box. "JD, you're just the fella I've been waiting for." And with that, he handed me the 2 cane poles in the box. "Now let's get down to the pond and see if we can catch us a mess of crappie." He took a pinch of snuff from a tin can in his coat pocket, and we set out. Now, Papa owned nearly 20 acres, and it had 2 good fishing holes on it. He kept a small john boat on the bank, and within a few minutes, we had loaded our gear in it and pushed out into the water. Now, we didn't have a trolling motor back then, since Papa claimed that it only scared the fish. Instead, he had a small paddle that he used to scully silently in one hand while he held his fishing pole in the other. And sure enough, within a few minutes, he would already be spinning a yarn. "JD, did I ever tell you about old Amos Higgins?" "No, sir, I don't believe you have." "Well, old Amos Higgins was a peculiar fella. It seemed like folks were always picking on him and making fun of him at his own expense. But it wasn't because he was helpless or small. No, quite the contrary, I tell you. Old Amos was a mighty big man, over 6 feet tall and nearly 300 pounds. And he had a master beard on his face, so thick that you could lose a small child in it. But his size didn't help him much when it came to his wife, Esther. That woman complained about every single thing he did. He couldn't do anything right in her eyes. If he brought home a can of coffee from the general store, she'd say that she had plenty in the house that was already getting stale. And if he brought home some molasses, she'd claim that he was just wasting money that she could have put to a better use. "Why, Amos Higgins, if you had an ounce of get up and go in you, you could put on that black slouch hat of yours and get out in the woods. There's plenty of wild beehives out there. Best of all, they're free and they taste much better than molasses. Instead of spending all of our money, you'd make better use of your time if you were even out there plowing in the field." JD, that's right. In Esther's mind, Amos was pert near worthless. Now, outside of the house, Amos didn't fare much better. His landlord was a man named Old Man Peters, and he didn't treat Amos any better than Esther did. If Amos planted taters, Old Man Peters claimed that he was wearing the land out, planting the same thing every year. But if Amos switched it up and planted corn or cotton, the old man would complain that he didn't have a lick of sense, since the price of corn and cotton was so low. In fact, Old Man Peters regretted that he had even ever rented that place out to Amos, and he had a good mind to put him out. The only place that Amos seemed to get any relief from all the arguing, fussing, and bickering was when he was out in the woods. And when he got to the point where he thought he couldn't stand it another minute, he'd wait until Esther wasn't looking, and then he'd take his gun down from the rack over the fireplace, pull his hat over his eyes, and then motion silently to Old Blue, his favorite hunting dog, and they'd set out for the mountains. There, they'd stay all day, and sometimes for an entire weekend, and then they'd come creeping humbly back home. Sometimes Amos would have a rabbit for Esther, or he'd even take a string of squirrels, and make a stew for old man Peters. He always hoped they'd be thankful for the treat and maybe excuse him for his absence. But it never happened that way. Esther would scream at him that he would leave them all to starve to death with his worthless behavior. And old man Peters, he threatened him that he ought to be putting his time to better use and come up with his rent money. And so it went for Amos Higgins. He got plumb tired of all the complaining, and he got to the point that he stayed out of the house just as much as he could and spent most of his time in the woods. Just then, Papaw Coy broke away from the story. "Pay attention, J.D. I saw your cork go under just now, and would you look at that?" he said as he pulled my line from the water. "He clean stole your worm, too. Here I am fishing for supper, and here you are feeding the fish an all-you-can-eat buffet of free worms." Then he rebaited my hook and gave me a quick wink and went back to his story. Anyhow, where was I? Oh yeah, there soon came a day that would change everything for old Amos. It started out this way. Amos and Old Blue were out hunting, not far from home, when he caught sight of a big old bear that was just moseying along through the laurel bushes. Now the sight of that bear, it made Amos's heart start racing. It sure would put me in good graces with Esther if I could get that bear, he thought. There's nothing she likes better than some nice tender bear steaks. And a new warm bear skin to cover that bed might even make the old gal thankful for a change. He watched until the bear stood still to examine a hollow tree. Now was his chance. So Amos lifted his gun, drew a careful bead, and then squeezed the trigger. Click. The hammer fell, but you see, the rifle didn't fire. And to make matters worse, that was Amos's last bullet. He had to think of something, and quick. He sure didn't want to lose that bear if he could help it. So he motioned to Old Blue to keep quiet, and slowly, both of them crept along after the critter, watching each step that he made. Directly after meandering around for a spell, the bear clawed his way up an old tree that was broken off at the top, and he let himself down inside of it, just as easy as if he'd been laying back in his favorite recliner. Now Amos hadn't been wandering through these woods for all these years for nothing, and despite what his fussing wife and old man Peters thought, he knew a thing or two about hunting, and Amos understood right away that there had to be a wild beehive in that tree. Surely that bear was after honey, and right away Amos got an idea. If he could somehow stop up the top of that tree with something or another, maybe he could trap that bear inside, and he might be able to keep him there long enough so that he could run home and fetch some more ammunition. Amos hurried cautiously to the foot of the tree. Inside, he could hear the bear greedily guzzling down that delicious honey. Amos quickly chose a jagged rock, buttoned it to his coat, slung the coat over his back, and tied his sleeves around his neck. And then silently as he could, he shimmied up the tree, and then he jammed that rock into the hole at the top of the tree. And would you believe it? It fit almost perfect. Well, almost. Except for one small spot that was about the size of a man's head. Well, inside the tree, the bear had stopped eating and was beginning to rustle around, all uneasy like. Oh no, Amos thought, that critter's done got suspicious in there. And any second now, he's liable to pop up as mad as a hornet right in my face. There weren't no time to climb down the tree and look for another stone to cover that hole. So, without a second thought, Amos snatched off his faithful hat. There happened to be a jagged edge of the rock sticking up on one side of the hole and a jagged piece of the tree trunk on the other. So Amos fitted his hat over the two pieces and jerked it down. And it fit just like a glove, too. So now the hole was covered and that bear was trapped inside of the tree. So Amos climbed down from the tree, and both he and the Old Blue struck out for home just as fast as they could. But you see, just before Amos got there, he began thinking about his hat. He couldn't put it out of his mind. What would Esther say if he came home without it? She'd never in the world believe that he'd used it to trap a bear. She'll say I ought to be ashamed of myself to lose a good hat. She'll kick up a storm of racket, Amos thought. With that in mind, the closer Amos got to home and facing his wife, the slower he went. The thought of facing her without his hat that she had given him on their wedding day, it made him so miserable that he finally decided not to go home at all. Anyhow, it was getting along towards sundown, so he laid down with Old Blue in a pile of leaves and slept there all night. Meanwhile, that bear was making a mighty effort to get out of that hollow tree. He humped himself against a stone over and over, but it wouldn't budge. So he put his head against Amos's hat and shoved upward. Just like that, the top of the bear's head came popping out of the tree with Amos's hat on top of his head. He strained mightily with his shoulders, and soon the stone flew out. Finally, the bear was free, with Amos's hat stuck on top of his head. It frightened him at first, and he tore through the bushes as fast as he could go, hoping it would fall off. But I tell you, that hat seemed like it was glued on top of his head. And after a while, he got used to it, and finally didn't pay no more mind to it. Well, anyhow, all that fighting up in the tree made that old bear powerful hungry, and he went right back to trying to find something to eat. But I tell you, he couldn't find a single blackberry. And afore long, he found himself at the edge of a little farm. And wouldn't you know it, it was Amos's farm. While Amos was out there in the woods hiding from his wife, here was a bear wearing Amos's hat, making himself right at home, searching for a bite to eat. Now, it was getting dusk as the bear rambled through the backyard and sniffed. There was a nice smell of honey in the air. And inside the kitchen, Esther was just setting out a jar of honey for supper to put on some biscuits that she had just made from scratch. That bear sniffed and sniffed again, and before you could say scoot, he had traced the smell to the kitchen door and peered inside just as Esther had gone to the bedroom to light a lamp. There on the table, set out invitingly, was a pot of honey. Seeing his chance, the bear came right into the kitchen and stuck his paw into the pot. Now in the next room, Esther heard the noise. She set off lighting the lamp and she poked her head into the half-dark kitchen. And the first thing she spied was Amos's black hat and a dark form bending over the honey pot. "Oh, there you are, you worthless man," cried Esther. "As if staying out all day, loafing off in the woods wasn't enough. Now here you are stealing my honey like an ordinary thief." With that, she rushed into the kitchen, grabbed the honey pot out of the bear's paws, and slapped him just as hard as she could, right across the face. But I tell you, that old bear wasn't having none of it. He grabbed poor Esther around the waist, and he gave her such a hug that pert near every bone in her body cracked. Then he threw her into the corner against the wall, grabbed the honey pot, and shuffled out the door. Poor Esther was flabbergasted. She had never in her life expected Amos to behave in that way. But the irony was, if the truth be told, Esther seemed scared and pleased at the same time. Who would have thought he had it in him to give her such a hug and then throw her down like a sack of meal? She looked out the door for her husband, the bear, but he was gone. Afore long, night fell, and it was completely dark, except for the moon that was out, all bright and silvery. The bear ambled on, and he was still hungry. The honey left out in Esther's pot hadn't nearly filled him up, and directly he passed along near old man Peter's pig pen. The sound of those pigs grunting sleepingly gave him an idea. A nice fat piglet would sure make a wonderful supper. So he shuffled over the pen, climbed the rail fence, and grabbed the fattest one. What a squealing those hogs put up. The bear was just climbing out of the pen when old man Peters came as fast as he could with his walking stick. "Oh, it's you," Peter said, as in the moonlight he caught sight of the dark form wearing Amos's hat. "So now you've taken to stealing. Oh, you'll carry off my pig, will you?" And just then, the old man gave the bear a crack over the skull with his walking stick. But in that moment, the bear dropped the pig and went for old man Peters. He made a great swipe with his claws and tore the old man's vest and shirt clean off, and even scratched a streak down the middle of his stomach. Then the bear lifted the unlucky landlord and threw him in the mud and muck inside the pig pen. And then, feeling a little upset over that crack over the head from that walking stick, he tore out towards the woods. "What in tarnation?" groaned old man Peters. "The worm has turned," he thought to himself as he picked himself up out of the mud, climbed out of the pig pen, and tottered back to the house. Well, anyhow, all this time, poor Amos had been laying fast asleep in the leaves. And when he woke up the following morning, what should he see lying nearby but his old black hat? The bear had scraped it off on a low-hanging limb as he ran through the bushes and made his way to the hills. Amos was plumb tickled, so he picked up his hat, put it on, and finally found the courage to go home. And as he went shuffling along, He hoped that Esther wouldn't be at the house when he got there. Maybe she'd be down at the spring house getting butter, or in the garden picking turnip greens. Then he could sneak in, get his gun shells, and get away without being seen. But there was no such luck, because as soon as he got home, there she was, standing in the kitchen. But then the darndest thing happened. To his surprise, Esther was all gussied up and smiling like a basket of chips, in a way that she hadn't done since her wedding day. She had on her Sunday go-to-meeting dress, and her hair was all crimped and curled. "I'm so glad to see you, honey. Darling," she corrected herself, remembering how he had snatched that honey pot from her. And just like that, she lovingly took him by the arm and led him into the kitchen. "Do sit down. You must be hungry after being away so long." And then she set out a plate of stewed chicken and dumplings that she had already fixed for him. Amos was astonished. He wondered if he was still on earth or he had died and gone to heaven. And after that wonderful meal, it came to him that he hadn't fed old man Peter's pigs for 2 days running. So he kissed his wife and hurried out of the house, grabbed some corn and went to the pig pen. "Oh, there you are." Peters came stumping along with his walking cane, all smiles. "Right on the job as usual. I never saw such a man for work." Oh, he was so full of speeches, was that old man Peters. I tell you, it was the funniest thing I ever saw. Just then, Papaw Coy was snapped back to the present when he hooked a big old crappie and pulled him into the boat. "Papaw, then what happened? Did Amos explain everything that had happened?" I asked. "JD, just remember this. When a man is in the good graces of his wife, it's best not to mess things up by asking too many questions. Just enjoy it while it lasts, because when a woman loves you, life don't get no better. Now come on now, let's get these fish all cleaned up before your Granny Tollett thinks we're out here just dilly-dallying." Just like that, we pulled the boat back on the bank and set out walking towards the house. There would be fried fish that night, but for me, it was another memory made with the best yarn spinner I've ever known, Papaw Coy.